crops. Remember, they farm near the volcano because the soil is good. But it kills all the plants that people are hoping to eat that year. And most people are only one food crop away from going hungry. They don't store their food. They grow it and immediately eat it. So if that food crop is ruined, there's nothing to eat for many, many miles in every direction. And this is how volcanoes have harmed people the most, by making them go hungry. Sometimes a volcano will throw so much dust into the sky, it'll go all the way around the world in a thin cloud, filtering the sunlight just enough to make the world cool off just a fraction of a degree. And that year will be called the year without summer, where people will be wondering, why is it so cold this summer and our food crops are not growing and we're going hungry? They didn't understand that on the other side of the world, a volcano was pumping ash into the sky, cooling the whole world off. And these years without summer have changed history. They've made civilizations fall. Now there's one more thing that a volcano will do, which is the rarest of all, but the scariest of all. And that's when it'll simply explode all at once with a great big boom! A boom so loud, the sound is a wall of air squeezed to the density of iron, rushing out at 600 miles an hour, the speed of sound, flattening everything in its path. Flattening the trees, flattening the hills, and flattening everything living there. A boom that can be heard for 3,000 miles. A boom that makes a mountain into a hole in the ground. A boom that can make an island vanish. A boom that can push a wall of water many, many yards high around the world twice. A boom that makes the world ring like a bell and makes nuclear bombs look like tiny firecrackers in comparison. And these explosions are caused by a bubble. But not a bubble of mere carbon dioxide. A bubble of something far more powerful. This stuff, this lava rock full of holes, resembles something that's in your kitchen right now. Back home, right now in your kitchen, there's something that's yellow or pink or light green. You use it to wipe things up and clean it. What am I thinking of? No? Yes? A sponge. Sponges are full of holes and they're really good at soaking up water. Lava rock is full of holes and it's really good at soaking up water. If you have a mountain made out of this stuff, sitting out in the weather for thousands of years, it's going to soak up all that rainwater and it'll soak into all those zillions of bubble holes, and almost all of it will stay inside. Volcanoes are full of water. They're waterlogged. They're giant rock sponges. So let's do an experiment, okay? Let's pretend that this is a volcano. Kind of looks like one, and it's been sitting out in the weather for thousands of years, soaking up rainwater. So we'll just put a little bit in. And whenever a volcano erupts, because volcanoes erupt and then they stop and they erupt and they stop. And whenever a volcano erupts, the lava and the ash come out, they pile up on the outside, making it bigger and bigger. But then when it stops erupting for a while, the lava and the ash that were on their way out, but didn't quite make it all the way out, that stuff will cool and harden and plug up the volcano. And it's called a lava plug, trapping everything inside. And it'll sit that way for a year or 10 years or 10,000 years, until one day it's time for the magma to rise again. And that magma is at least 2,000 degrees, sometimes much hotter. And what happens when you heat up water? I'm looking for a word that starts with B, has something to do with cooking vegetables. It boils. And how do you know when water is boiling? Why, of course, you see the bubbles. But the bubbles of steam, which is what you get when you boil water, are far, far more powerful than the bubbles of mere carbon dioxide. The bubbles of steam will become hundreds of times bigger than the water that makes it. This tiny amount of water in here will become way too big to stay inside. It's going to be pushing with tremendous force, trying to get out. James Watt, the man who invented the steam engine, realized this is a gigantic source of energy. Just keep water inside a container and boil it. Here we go. The magma rises from deep in the earth and immediately boils the water trapped in all the bubble holes of the volcano. And the steam pushes and pushes in all directions. But it's held down by millions of tons of rock on top. And something's going to have to give. Something's going to have to break. Something's going to have to blow. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Thank you. Was that cool? Would you like to see that again? Yeah. Okay. Now that you heard, that was the boom I mentioned earlier. These steam explosions are the single most violent thing the Earth can do. It's such an extremely simple thing, but it's extremely powerful. Now this is a nice, polite little volcano that always explodes straight up. Sometimes they're not so nice, they explode sideways, and you don't want to be on that side because there'll be nothing left of you but individual carbon atoms. If you're on the far side of an exploding volcano, you'll feel a shaking and you'll hear a sort of a thunder-like sound. But if you're on the exploding side, you won't hear anything because the blast will come at you faster than the sound. Okay, here we go. Ready? Yeah. Hundreds of times bigger than the water that makes it. There really is no force that can hold it back. Sooner or later, the pressure is greater than any weight on top of it. Thank you. And remember, don't try this at home. Or your best friends either. If that was screwed on tight without a cork instead of if it had a lid, that would be a glass hand grenade. So no. Okay. Now, because people have lived near volcanoes for thousands of years, people have wonderful stories, myths, and legends about volcanoes and how they do what they do. For instance, long ago in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where there were and still are many volcanoes, people used to believe in all sorts of gods for everything that they saw in nature. There were gods of the land, the sea, and the sky. Everything nature did, there was a god busy doing it. And there was even a god for volcanoes. And his name was Vulcan. That's where we get the name volcano. Volcano means Vulcan's home. And people believed that Vulcan was the god who made things for the other gods. So when the king of the gods, Zeus, said, "Vulcan, make me this weapon," Vulcan would make it for him. And when the queen of the gods, Hera, said, "Vulcan, make me this magical thing," Vulcan would make it for her. And he lived and he worked inside mountains that people called volcanoes, Vulcan's home. And so when the ground shook around a volcano, as often it will, people would say, Vulcan must be pounding his mighty hammer on his anvil to make something for one of the other gods. And when smoke and fire came out the top, they thought, Vulcan must be stoking the flames of his huge furnace to melt the metals he needs for whatever is that wonderful and terrible thing for the other gods. And so that is how people of ancient Greece and Rome, long ago, explained to each other how volcanoes do what they do. But now I'm going to tell you a true story about people in volcanoes. Two stories. One's a sad story, but the last one is a happier story. Long ago in ancient Rome, there was, and there still is, a volcano called Vesuvius. And Vesuvius is a volcano that can be quiet for hundreds of years at a time. So when the first Romans came into the area, because the soil was good, all they ever saw coming out of the top of Vesuvius was a little steam. So they thought it was one of Vulcan's little project workshops, and they paid no attention. And because the soil was good, the farming was good. So soon a beautiful town grew up at the base of Vesuvius, a town named Pompeii. And Pompeii was such a beautiful place that people from all over Rome would come to vacation there. And every once in a while, people would feel the ground shake a little bit, but they got used to it. You get used to anything you get exposed to over and over again. You begin to ignore it. But one day in 79 AD, the ground began to really shake, and things started falling off the shelves. And then it shook even worse, and the shelves started falling off the walls. And then it shook even worse, and cracks started forming in the walls, and this got people so scared that most people packed up their stuff and they got out of town. There were about 20,000 people living in Pompeii, and about 2,000 people remained behind to guard their homes and keep their businesses going. They had felt shaking before. This was just worse than they were used to, so they thought they could ride it out. And then after a while, the shaking stopped, and they were glad they hadn't left. And it got really, really quiet. In fact, it got spooky quiet, where the wind didn't blow, animals made no sound, birds didn't sing. It was silent. And out of that spooky silence, there suddenly came an enormous poof, and a huge black cloud of ash came rushing out of the top of Vesuvius, black and laced with lightning. It spread from horizon to horizon, blocking out the sun. And in the middle of the day, the town of Pompeii was plunged into utter darkness, darker than the darkest night. And then that ash began to fall. And it fell on the ground, and it piled up, and it piled up, and it piled up deeper and deeper and deeper until it was as much as 60 feet deep. That is about 5 times deeper than the ceiling is above your heads right now. And the entire town of Pompeii was buried in ash. Eventually, the volcano stopped erupting, and the ash cloud drifted away. The people who had left Pompeii came back to find their town had disappeared. This scared them so much, they moved away and never built there again. And soon, the ash that would be hard rock beneath was good soil on top, so grass, bushes, and trees grew there. And there was no trace there had ever been a town there. And so for more than 1,000 years, the town of Pompeii was forgotten to history. 1,000 years after that eruption, some farmers came into the area because the soil was good. And they dug ditches to bring water to water their crops. And at the bottom of the deepest ditch, they found the top of a building buried underground. It's got them very curious. So they dug deeper and they found the walls of buildings. They dug deeper and they found stone-paved streets, the way the ancient Romans used to pave their streets. And so for the last 1,000 years, we have been digging up the town of Pompeii that was preserved in a moment in solid rock. This is why we know so much about how the ancient Romans lived their daily lives, because every object in every room, in every home is still there, waiting for us to pick through the rock to find it. Now that's the sad story about people and volcanoes, but as I promised, I'll follow with a happier one. Not nearly as long ago, but before you guys were born, something happened out in the cold and stormy North Atlantic Ocean in a place called Iceland. Iceland is a big island surrounded by a bunch of little bitty islands, and one of them is called Heimaey, which means good harbor. A harbor is where the water is smooth and flat, and the stormy waves of the North Atlantic won't bash the boats together and won't bash them against the shore. A safe parking lot for boats. And Heimaey is the best harbor in all of Iceland. So everyone living on the island, they all have boats and they all fish the sea, and they love to do that. Well, back in the mid-1960s, everyone knew there was a volcano on their island, but just like Vesuvius, no one had ever seen it erupt. Well, one night, in the middle of the night, everyone was awakened by an enormous crack, and a split went right across the middle of the island. And out of the top of the volcano came this thick, chunky lava rolling slowly down the hill toward the town of Heimaey. Now, people in Iceland don't have trees. It's too cold for trees to grow there, so they build their homes out of brick, stone, and mortar. And so when the hot lava reached the first row of houses, they didn't start catching fire. It just built up behind them until it got deep enough to spill over the rooftops and start filling up the next street, until it got deep enough to spill over the next row of houses and start filling up the next street. And it was happening slowly enough that people had enough time to get some of their things and get in their boats and escape to safety on the big island of Iceland. And they got together and they could look out over the horizon. They could see their little island of Heimaey, and they could see